Malachi Martin, God's messenger.
And I will come near you for judgment, and I will be a swift witness against the sorcerers, and against the adulterers, and against those swearing to a lie, and against those who extort from the hired laborer's pay, and turning away the widow, and the fatherless, and the alien, and not fearing me, says the Lord God of hosts. The prophet Malachi, chapter 3, verse 5.
What has happened, and why is it so difficult? And is it going to change? And are you simply out of step? Should you be in step with the general march and stop worrying about things?
In this world, you're either serving Christ or you're serving Lucifer. There are only two issues at stake. There's good and there's bad, and good is represented by Christ and bad is represented by Lucifer.
Lucifer is in his last place. He's going to extremes because he knows the end is near of this period. How many of us will see it? I don't know. Do I want to see it? I'm indifferent. What I have to do has to be done every day. Carry my cross after him daily, as he said. That's all that's necessary. We've only one thing to do, and that is faith and the rosary and the Blessed Sacrament and Mass. We needn't bother about anything else. We haven't got the grace to do anything about it. He has not put us in a position to do anything about it. And all we do is live in our faith and die in our faith and don't compromise.
In 1981, when he lay in Gemelli Hospital in Rome, he had a vision. He had the Fatima vision. He saw it. God revealed it to him. He saw the whole thing.
Pope John Paul II in Fulda in 1980, when confronted with very fervent German Catholics, they said, Holy Father, why don't you renew the church? He said, I can't. Renewal is impossible until Our Lady comes. He was quoting the echo of that letter. And then he put his hand in his pocket and pulled out his rosary and said, that's your only weapon, the rosary. Pray, pray, and do nothing else but pray. So his mind from the very beginning was made up. I cannot renew my church. It can't be renewed because renewal is only possible through grace. You can't do it by organization. You can't do it by any human means. That is his attitude, and that's the explanation of it. In Ireland alone, the amount of virgins, statues of the Virgin have started crying. There's a book written about it I have in my library. And I suspect hoaxes everywhere because the devil is so clever. He's so intelligent. And he's introduced great confusion about this.
Rome leaves an indelible imprint on your soul. The Italians say, non si parla di Roma. You never leave Rome. And it's true. You never leave Rome in your spirit, even if you leave it in body.
He was called the ultimate Vatican insider, the George Orwell of the true Roman Catholic Church. Christened with the name Malachi, meaning God's messenger, he followed in the footsteps of the last of the Old Testament prophets and a great Irish saint by that name. This is the true story of a priest and scholar, archaeologist and linguist, assistant exorcist, a best-selling world-renowned author whose works were prophetic, an aide to Augustine Cardinal Bea attached to the Vatican, who, after a series of unexpected events in the Eternal City, found his home in America. His family, his friends, spiritual children and acquaintances liked him tremendously. Father Charles Fiore, Malachi's closest friend and confidant, said of Martin, I'm personally convinced he was a great man and an exemplary priest, a priest who helped more people than anyone I have known in a long, long time. Liam Toohey remembered Malachi fondly, calling him gutsy and blunt, and a bit of a maverick. Michael Matt wrote of him, such an extraordinary mind is not likely to come again soon in our beleaguered church. And his literary agent Lala Karff remarked that, had Malachi not been a Catholic, the press would have called him one of the greatest writers of our time. Most recalled his humour, wit, and Irish charm. He had a quick ability to see the good in others, an admirable quality for one who was constantly up against it, face to face with evil. Pretty impressive altogether for a young boy from County Kerry, and that's where it all began, in Ireland.
Shortly before the end of the Irish Revolution, a half a year before the establishment of the Irish Free State, and just 14 months before the death of Michael Collins, an interesting thing happened in an old County Kerry town. Now, there were no comets flashing through the sky the night before he was born, no dramatic signs in the sky, or aurora borealis, or any other sort of miraculous events, though it was not an altogether insignificant day in the history of the Catholic Church in the 20th century. Nor was it without its complications. You see, Malachi Martin, a premature infant, was baptized in the womb and entered into this world a baptized Catholic. And all this happened in Ballylongford, County Kerry, Ireland, on July the 23rd, 1921. Interestingly, Ballylongford is not far from the birthplace of the great 12th century Irish saint, Saint Malachi of Armagh, Archbishop O'Connor. His father, an Englishman who immigrated to Ireland, was a gynecologist. His mother was Irish. There were 9 children in all. Netta, whose real name was Etnia, Kathleen, Joan, and Maura, Francis Xavier, Liam, Connor, Malachi, and Jimmy. Little Jimmy died very young. Connor, Liam, Francis Xavier, and Malachi all went on to wear the collar. Father Connor and Father Francis Xavier were professors at the University of Dublin, and Father Liam was an Augustinian. Malachi had excellent marks in high school and graduated second in his class. The only boy who had better grades was a young lad named Dermot Ryan. Ryan later went on to become a bishop. Young Malachi entered the Society of Jesus at the age of 18 and attended Belvedere College in Dublin. As a student at National University, he received his bachelor's degree in Semitic languages and Oriental history, with parallel studies in Assyriology at Trinity College. From there, Martin travelled on to Belgium, where he got his degrees in philosophy, theology, Semitic languages, archaeology, and Oriental history at the University of Louvain.
On August the 15th, 1954, the Feast of the Assumption, Malachi Martin was ordained to the priesthood.
Young Father Martin did parallel studies at Hebrew University, Jerusalem, and at Oxford, specializing in intertestamentary studies and knowledge of Jesus in Hebrew and Arabic manuscripts. He also gave much time and effort to physics, anthropology, and psychology, and did early and seminal work on the Dead Sea Scrolls. The Dead Sea Scrolls contain the writings of a Jewish sect called the Qumran community, along with certain sections of scriptures, including the original manuscripts of the prophet Isaiah and others. Having an extensive knowledge of ancient Semitic languages, Malachi also took part in some fascinating archaeological digs in the Middle East. It was there, in Egypt, where he performed his first exorcism on a young Egyptian, as fellow writer and friend Henry King recalls.
And I one time asked him, I said, how did you get into this? Where did you assist? Where did you do your first exorcism? I did it in Egypt. He said, there was nobody else available. And it was a Muslim. It was not a Roman Catholic. But he helped. This fellow was diabolically possessed. And at the time of the book, Hostage to the Devil, Malachi Martin, incidentally, had accounts of 106 other cases of diabolical possession in his files. He was always an assistant, by the way. He never presided over. He was never the exorcist. He assisted.
In 1958, Father Martin was summoned to Rome, a journey that was to change the course of his life forever.
During his years at the Vatican, he was a top aide to Cardinal Bea, one of the most powerful members of the Roman Curia. From 1958 until 1964, Malachi Martin saw the inner workings of 2 papacies, Pope John XXIII and Pope Paul VI, and he carried out many sensitive missions under the supervision of Cardinal Bea. Father Martin also attended the sessions of the Second Vatican Council.
There was a very carefully laid out integrated plan to make sure that no statement of the Vatican Council, if possible, couldn't be ambivalent. And I remember Cardinal Bea coming to see me once in my room in Rome, and this was 1962, sweating. And the council had just begun. It was November 1962. And I asked him why he was disturbed. He said, because I've just heard an awful remark by Hans Kung. He was talking to, and he named an American theologian, who is now a bishop, who shall remain unnamed. And said, come in answer to a question by this man. I didn't hear the question. Said, oh, no. This time we're not going to leave. We're not going to have another Reformation. We're staying inside this time. When it came to the Vatican Council itself, as you know, the last vote in the Council in 1965 concerned the Mass. And the bishops were absolutely categorical. They said, do not wipe out the Latin. Keep the Latin Mass, but translate the popular part, meaning the Credo, the Gloria, the prayer before Mass, the introibo Mass, prayers as we call them, and the communion prayers at the end. Put those in the popular language. But the canon stands. This is the Council. And I remember that a bishop who had visited Paul VI just after the end of the Council in December 1965 came in to me here in New York and said, you know, Malachi, the most extraordinary thing happened to me. I was speaking with the Pope, His Holiness, 2 days ago. And I congratulated him on the vote in the Council. And he said, don't speak to me about the vote. Don't congratulate me. There are already 18 new canons in vogue in France. They've gone haywire. They've already translated into vernacular, and the thing is not valid anymore. And I had no control over it. So what happened? Well, there was a character called Bugnini, Annibale Bugnini, who was a Freemason, member of the lodge, who set as his goal to create a new ceremony in the Catholic Church. He has this in his articles published in the Italian Revista, which could be accepted by anybody, Catholic or non-Catholic or non-Christian. The official canon of the Mass now, and the new Mass, the Novus Ordo, was composed by 6 Protestant clergymen and 2 Catholic clergymen. I mean, how bastardized can you become? No matter how pious and good these men were, they're not Catholics. They didn't know the Catholic tradition.
While still a Jesuit in Rome, he wrote his first book, a 2-volume work entitled The Scribal Character of the Dead Sea Scrolls. Martin's second work was called The Pilgrim. It was also written during this time at St. Peter's, published under the pen name of Michael Seraphian. And at the celebrated Pontifical Biblical Institute, he was a professor of Hebrew, Aramaic, paleography, and scripture.
I was trained as a paleographer. Most of our listeners don't know what that is. It's somebody who studies handwriting. And my expertise was in Middle Eastern handwriting about the time of Abraham. But that became a very useful profession for the then Pope John the 23rd, because he needed contacts with both Arabs and Jews, and I traveled extensively in that area, the Middle East, and therefore I was useful to him. And I got very closely associated with John the 23rd and a certain cardinal called Cardinal Augustin Bea. He was the man who was in charge of ecumenism and who traveled extensively in the States during the Council.
In February 1960, the world was on the verge of a kind of an orchestrated chaos that it had never seen the likes of at any time before. In Rome, Father Malachi Martin was in the papal apartment, standing just outside of Pope John the 23rd's room. Some 30 years later, he recalled to Father Charles Fiore the shock, the anger he felt towards good Pope John that day. Fiore repeated word for word what Martin said about that day inside the Vatican.
Malachi Martin, with his typical Irish humor, said, I cooled my heels in the corridor outside the Holy Father's apartments while my boss, Cardinal Bea, was inside debating with the Holy Father and with a group of other bishops and priests and 2 young Portuguese seminarians who translated the letter, a single page written in Portuguese, for all of those in the room.
The letter he referred to was a letter from Sister Lucy of Fatima, and the contents contained the highly secret 3rd secret of Fatima. The only living souls who knew the contents were Sister Lucy, the Bishop of Fatima, the Pope, his aides, and the translators. The letter was addressed to the Pope of 1960 and had been written by Sister Lucy some years earlier during the reign of Pius XII. It was delivered from Sister Lucy to the Bishop of Fatima, and from there sent on to Pope Pius. It was the common expectation among Catholics that in 1960 the Pope would tell the entire world this 3rd secret. As the 6th decade of the 20th century drew nearer and nearer, uneasiness among Catholics was growing over what the Virgin told Lucia, Francisco, and Jacinta. Exactly what was it in this mysterious 3rd secret? What did it involve? And after the year 1960 came and went, the people were mystified as to why the 3rd secret was not announced as all had expected. Nearly 40 years later, Malachi Martin offered some explanation as to what happened.
The Queen of Heaven gave a mandate. She said, consecrate Russia to me on one day, all you bishops together. and Russia will be converted to Catholicism. I mean, it wasn't really converted, it will become Catholic, and Marxism will be finished. And there'll be no chance. If you don't do that, my son is going to punish you all. And John the 23rd, and Paul the 6th, and John Paul II, all three neglected this. John the 23rd said, the children didn't know what they were saying. They thought Russia was a whore in the streets of Elizabeth. And anyway, I'm talking with Nikita Khrushchev. This is 1962, and he will allow observers to come to my Vatican Council if I don't condemn Marxism. And therefore John Windsor didn't allow the fathers of the council to condemn Marxism. And he certainly would not publish he said, we will not publish this letter ever. It will never be published. And I will not consecrate Russia. Because if I did that, Nikita Khrushchev would know, and he'd consider it an act of war. All the bishops, Catholic bishops, gathered in a place, 2,700 of them in the Vatican, and they condemn Russian Marxism, Soviet Marxism. Come on, it's war. There's going to be persecution. That's John 23rd reason. Paul VI simply was afraid of his own shadow, and besides, he didn't believe in Fatima. John Paul II sort of believed in Fatima, sort of. He didn't quite believe in Fatima. And he decided that he couldn't do it because he wasn't the Pope of 1960. And Lucy had originally said the Pope of 1960 must do the consecration. So he did nothing about it. In fact, he permitted the suppression of Sister Lucia and permitted the suppression of the message of Fatima to a large extent throughout the church, because his Secretary of State, Casaroli, who is an atheist as far as I'm concerned, he exercised himself as Secretary of State through all Vatican representatives to suppress Fatima as much as possible. For instance, the apostolic delegates in Lisbon and his entire staff were very favorable to Fatima. Casaroli changed them all and put in somebody who was not sympathetic. And so on and went on with that. So why is it that these three popes, the last three popes, refused? And when John Paul II was asked to now consecrate Russia, no, all he could do was kneel in St. Peter's Square, and in the middle of a consecration of the human race, the Immaculate Heart of Mary, he said, and also we consecrate to her care the people who are awaiting their consecration to her Immaculate Heart. What kind of gobbledygook is that? For me, that's gobbledygook, and disgusts me on John Paul II's lips. He's supposedly a knight of the Immaculate Queen. He's supposedly a member of Maximilian Kolbe's group of knights fighting, and he wouldn't do this. So I mean, I think it all goes back to Lucifer. He just has too much power within the prelacy of the church, within the organization. He's able to squeeze everybody who attempts that thing. This is the Queen of Heaven. And even as John 23rd said, Nikita Khrushchev will declare war on us. He can say, well, you want this done, you must have some plan. Trust. No trust. No trust. So I think it is clear to me that the will of Christ is that these three popes should destroy the organization of the church, which they have. They've destroyed the organization. They've been instrumental. And they will answer for it. And in the case of John Paul II and John 23rd and Paul VI, it's malfeasance in high office. They're not supposed to do that. They're supposed to take care of that. They didn't.
Malachi Martin went to his grave with the knowledge of the contents of the letter and the third secret of Fatima. Though we do know that Cardinal Ratzinger told the ambassador of Japan that the third secret of Fatima was the same message of Our Lady of Akita. Attorney Peter B. Kelly is a close friend of Father Charles Fiore. He has researched this topic thoroughly.
The bishop of Akita, Japan, a man named Bishop John S. Ito, carefully reviewed the apparitions of Akita, Japan shortly after their occurrence in the early 70s. And he found that they were authentic according to his review, and I think a very important aspect is that the local bishop approves of the apparition. Bishop Ito determined, after his research, that the rather apocalyptic message of Akita, Japan, was actually the message, he believed, of the third secret of Fatima. Cardinal Ratzinger, there's a reference to the book by John Haffert. The book was called The Day I Didn't Die. Interesting name for a book. Makes reference in one of the footnotes to a conversation that took place between Cardinal Ratzinger and actually it was an ambassador to the Vatican from the Philippines, where he reaffirmed that this message of Akita, Japan, according to Cardinal Ratzinger, who does know, by the way, the third secret as contained in the safe place in the Vatican, he did confirm that the message of Akita was the message of the third secret.
Father Charles Fiore.
It's clear from my many conversations with Malachi that he was a firm believer in Fatima and the appearances of Our Lady to the children there. He also made it very clear that he believed that the third secret had to do with conditions within the church, which makes it very interesting that he died almost 11 months to the day before Cardinal Ratzinger supposedly on June the 26th of the year 2000 revealed the third secret of Fatima. What's very interesting, however, is that, as Peter Kelly has said, Cardinal Ratzinger himself is on public record as admitting that the approved apparition of Our Lady to Sister Agnes Sasagawa of Akita, Japan, is almost identical with what Our Lady was supposed to have said many years previously in 1917 to the children of Fatima. Let me read you something from Cardinal Ratzinger that appeared in Lay Witness, which I believe is the newsletter of Catholics United for the Faith, in 1987. It is not made public, at least for the moment, in order to prevent religious prophecy from being turned into sensationalism. In reality, the announcement of a chastisement, even a conditional one such as nuclear war or cosmic disaster, could, if it were made without preparation, provoke the contrary to the desired effect. Instead of engendering a conversion which brings forth serenity, it might give rise to panic and despair. Please note, the content of the third secret, this is Cardinal Ratzinger, the content of the third secret corresponds to what is confirmed by many other Marian apparitions, beginning with what is already known of Fatima. Conversion and penance are the essential conditions for salvation. Well, then one wonders if he was so concerned back then about the possibility of throwing the entire world into a panic if the third secret was revealed, then what we were given by Cardinal Ratzinger, the same Cardinal Ratzinger, on June the 26th of the year 2000, just 13 years after this previous statement, one wonders how could what he gave us on June 26, 2000 cause consternation and panic? And at the same time, Cardinal Sodano says it refers to the past, to the events of the 20th century. So what does Sister Agnes Sasagawa, what did she say in 1973, the seer of Akita? And Akita is officially approved by the church, by the bishop of the place. A little over a half century after the events in Fatima, the Blessed Mother reportedly appeared to a nun in Japan. And according to Sister Agnes, the Blessed Mother said, "If men do not repent and better themselves, the Father will inflict a terrible punishment on all humanity. The work of the devil will infiltrate even into the church in such a way that one will see cardinals opposing cardinals and bishops against other bishops. The priests who venerate me will be scorned and opposed by their confreres. Churches and altars will be sacked. The church will be full of those who accept compromises, and the demon will press many priests and consecrated souls to leave the service of the Lord." We have two different Cardinal Ratzingers. We have two different messages. But Malachi was consistent all the way through. He believed that the third secret of Fatima had to do not with the fall of atheistic communism per se, but with the internal problems of the Catholic Church. In fact, he told his own sister back in 1960 that by the year 2000, that is 40 years later, the institutional church that we knew in 1960, that is before the Vatican Council, would no longer exist. And I submit to you that he was prophetic.
The Blessed Virgin Mary, she did appear 6 times in 1917. And the last time was October 13, 1917, to 3 children and to 75,000 people. There was a miracle, the miracle of Fatima. At noontime at Fatima in Portugal, the miracle of the sun. It's the paramount miracle of the 20th century, perhaps the 5th century. She did convey 3 secrets to those children and told them not to publish them yet, but to convey them to the local bishop. And one of those secrets has become the famous 3rd secret. We know now the general lines of that secret. In fact, we know details. But the one outstanding thing was, Our Lady said that the Pope of 1960 had to open the envelope and read this secret and then do what she said. And the secret apparently, on the authority of the Pope, on the authority of Cardinal Ratzinger, on the authority of many people, said the following. It was an either-or. It was an ultimatum. The world is gone so far, by this time, the secret said, that unless Russia is converted by being consecrated to my Immaculate Heart, then faith will disappear from nations and continents. Cardinals and bishops and priests will fall like leaves into hell. In other words, it was an either-or. But if the Pope, in union with the bishops of the Church, in 1960, consecrates Russia, just Russia, the Soviet Union, the USSR, to my Immaculate Heart, then Russia will be converted and faith will be restored. The consecration hasn't been done. The point I'm making to you, Bernard, is that Our Lady's either-or is in action. She said, unless this is done, unless it's made public to all nations and all governments, all people, then faith will disappear from nations and continents. There will be huge catastrophes. Many people will die. But in the end, my Immaculate Heart will save people.
And though Father Martin never disclosed the secret, everyone close to him knew how important it was to him, as Father Paul Wickens tells us.
Well, Father Malachi Martin also was a great believer in the apparition of Our Lady at Fatima, Portugal, in 1917. And he felt that this was the sign that God sent into the world to get man to pray more and do penance, and especially to be faithful to the duties of his state and life, and also that the Pope would consecrate, in union with all the Catholic bishops, consecrate Russia to the Immaculate Heart of Mary, and then we would begin beginning of world peace. Father Malachi had a great love of the Blessed Mother Mary, and he talked to her with the greatest respect and love, and her ability to perform miracles and intercede for the world.
Many look to their governments as problem-solving, benevolent grandfather figures. Malachi Martin, however, was Irish-born, and Ireland, for centuries, was an occupied nation. Not surprisingly, the Irish are far less trusting of governments, so it should come as no great surprise that Malachi was capable of doubting a church bureaucrat or two. As his time in Rome was passing by, he was quickly becoming aware of a strange change in Vatican circles, a certain type of corruption, a quiet, calculating, menacing corruption. Modernist heretics were trampling upon traditionalists, and liberalism was rampant. But this was something more. Something far more serious had taken control over his beautiful Jesuit order and all other orders in the city and the world. The smoke of Satan had entered into the Church. It was an earth-shattering time in the Catholic Church and for the entire world. Martin always stressed this particular point in his writing and public speaking, the primacy of Vatican politics and geopolitical events. What affects the Church affects those outside it. If there is disruption and chaos within the Catholic Church, all non-Catholic cultures will be affected as well.
If we are attacked, they're going to be attacked. Our enemies are their enemies. Why don't they wake up to the fact that we stand or fall together in a certain sense? But you see, that is one of the most ancient and nativist prejudices of us Americans, anti-Catholicism, anti-Romanism. Whereas if those fools only realized their enemies are our enemies, and if they destroy us, they'll be destroyed.
Knowing that corruption of the best is the worst kind, and seeing just how much the one true church was now poisoned from within, Malachi was faced with the moment of truth, compromise, and advance through the art of politicking, or somehow go public with this strange, bizarre, and unpleasant reality. Never again could he look at life the same way, knowing what he knew now. He knew he had to fight. But as a man who knew too much, he was faced with the challenge of how to go about doing it. Malachi quickly came to the conclusion that there was only one way to accomplish this: flee and fight. So in 1964, he asked Pope Paul to give him a special dispensation, to free him of the vows of obedience and poverty. Pope Paul told Martin that his request was not a regular one. You must belong to a diocese, Paul told Malachi, or you must belong to a religious order, to which Malachi replied, Holy Father, canon law is human law, over which you have jurisdiction. Surely you, the Pope, can make an exception here. For what I am going to do, I must not be subject to being silenced by a superior. Though this sort of dispensation is rare, nonetheless it has and can happen. And Father Malachi was able to convince Pope Paul of the need for this dispensation, due to the special circumstances of his new mission. The Pope granted Malachi his wishes. He was dispensed of his vows of obedience and poverty, but not of celibacy.
So he granted me that and gave me a general commission to write and to be active in the field of communications about the church.
Malachi Martin left Rome for Paris. There, penniless, he worked translating books to pay for food and shelter. This lasted for about 8 to 10 months, and then he returned home to Ireland. Malachi stayed with his sister and her husband, but the troubles followed Malachi there. Jesuits from Rome stalked him in Ireland. These Jesuits had been in contact with the Martin family while Malachi was in France, telling the Martins that Malachi had suffered a breakdown in Rome in order to discredit Malachi with his family when he finally did come home. He has become mentally ill, the Jesuits told the Martins. To escape these men, he traveled to America and began a new chapter in his life as the emigrant in New York.
In many respects, Malachi was no different from any other immigrant. He came to America to escape dangers in the old country. His life was in danger. He had no money and had to work several jobs to put food on the table. He washed dishes and worked as a waiter in restaurants and drove taxicabs. But even there, living anonymously in New York, he was not left alone. The machinery went into work full-time on his reputation. His credibility had to be destroyed, and the misinformation began circulating.
Rumor number one, he became involved with a woman. The story went like this. The wife of an Australian reporter who was covering the council for Time magazine supposedly left Rome with Malachi. The truth of it was she left Rome on the same day Father Martin left the Eternal City. Rumor number two, he had been defrocked. A bold-faced lie. The Pope dispensed him from his vows of obedience and poverty, but he always kept his vow of chastity and said Mass, heard confessions, and performed exorcisms until his death. He wanted to be free of the vow of obedience because he knew that he had a mission in life and his authorities would be able to silence him if he spoke out against them. Rumor number three, he was really not Irish, but an Israeli, a Mossad agent. Rumor number four, a spy for the KGB. Well, the lies about Martin were constant. They still are to this day. Even now, after his death, publishers who sell his books are sent letters warning them that Malachi Martin is a fraud, a heretic, a liar, no different from Martin Luther or Henry VIII. On radio talk shows, certain persons claiming to be Malachi's secretaries, advisors, or confidants misrepresent the facts about Malachi's life and his message. Once in a letter to a friend, Malachi touched upon how he handled the lies, the slanders, the smears.
Well over 25 years ago, I wrote to my superior in Rome complaining about these attacks and suggesting a certain course of action. He wrote back, quoting that passage of John's Gospel where Christ warns his disciples that the time would come when they would be ostracized and persecuted by people who would do that to them and think they were doing God's will. Can't you suffer too, for God's sake? That was my superior's answer.
Martin also wrote, quote, abusers and calumniators are not out to get to the truth, to build up, to edify. Their bent is to destroy, to liquidate. Hence, no matter what information you give them, they will not desist. They will use it to further their destructive ambition. Hence, I found out there was no point in even trying to communicate with them. Everything they learned became merely grist for their grindstones of hate. Father Charles Fiore remembered how frustrated he became with his old friend for not speaking out against detractors. Malachi thought it was a chance for saintliness, but Fiore felt that for his station in life, he should stand up to these men, who were not only hurting Martin, but hurting the church. Finally, at Fiore's urging, he sued one of them for libel.
His response to the rumors, canards, and lies about him was, I thought, at times too piously passive, and I told him so. Perhaps he had dealt with them too long and was tired of denying them. He told me the story of a revered Jesuit lay brother in his days as a scholastic, whose victimhood Malachi saw as saintly. But I reminded him the obscure Jesuit brother was called by his own unique graces. He was not a public figure whose good name was critical to his livelihood. At my urging, with the help of his lawyer, Malachi confronted an especially vicious letter solicited by a Midwestern detractor that came from a major chancery and clearly with the collusion of its bishop.
For a time, he retained his status as an Irish citizen. In later years, however, he became an American citizen. Eventually, Malachi left the odd jobs and took up writing. For several years, he was editor of the religion section in National Review, and Martin quickly became the toast of the literary elite in New York. But being a priest first and writer second, he did not restrict himself only to the circles of the upper class. Friends remembered the amazing generosity he had for souls. Father Fiore told of how once, while walking down East 63rd Street, Malachi responded to a New York cab driver.
Once walking together on East 63rd Street in Manhattan, a cab driver stopped in traffic, spotted my Roman collar, and shouted, "Hey, Father, how you doing?" I waved and said something less than memorable, but Malachi said, "Let's talk with him." It took less than a minute. Traffic was still at a standstill, and as we approached, the cabbie spotted the plastic string rosary Malachi had in his hand and said, "I got one of them at home, but it broke." Malachi immediately gave the man his rosary. Most priests keep a desk full of them, but it typically was Malachi, not I, who gave his away.
Canadian Catholic reporter Bernard Jansen.
He did not carry himself as a celebrity. He was extremely friendly right from the very beginning. I came to the door and he said, "Come in." It was kind of like a warm welcome you'd expect from an Irishman. There was kind of a bond right from the very beginning because we had a common cause of working together to defend the faith. Malachi Martin was a man who used his time very efficiently, and he had carried on an enormous correspondence, and enabled to do that, plus carry on with his regular work. He had pastoral work, he had his communicating work with radio and TV. He authored many books. In order to carry on that workload, he had to work very efficiently, which he did. One time, when I came to interview Malachi Martin, he was late for the interviews. The reason he was late for the interviews is because he had gone out to purchase food for a family who was starving. He was an extraordinarily generous man. I was very surprised that when the listeners of our cassette tapes wrote to him, he always wrote back if they had a question. I was very surprised at the extent of his correspondence, and that he would take the time to write back to the faithful who must have sent in many, many letters. They always got a response if they asked a question. I know there was a large volume of correspondence. We do have actually some copies of it somewhere in our records, because sometimes people would write to us and tell us about the correspondence that they had. Quite often, it would be questions with regards to how to practice the faith in a time when it's difficult to do so, because in many cases the authorities were actually working against the faith rather than for the faith. And this confused the faithful, so he provided much guidance and help to people who weren't really being properly administered to because of the current crisis in the church.
Lila Carr.
He knew a family, an older couple who had grown children. The man was dying of cancer, and Malachi would sometimes hear his confession, and certainly was giving advice to the family, and had gotten to know them a good deal. The disease progressed slowly, but it was clear that this man was going to die. And he had, about a year before he died, he called his local parish, and the priest came and gave him the last rites. No, he anointed him. He didn't give him the last rites, but he did anoint him. But it was clear he wasn't imminently dying, so exactly what he did, I'm not sure. In any case, time went on, and the moment came when this gentleman was really dying. He was in extremis. And his wife called Malachi on the phone in tears, saying that she had called the priest again and told him that her husband was at death's door, literally, and asked him to come to give extreme unction. And the answer that the priest gave was chilling. He said, "I already did that a year ago. Don't you know that I'm running $1 million business here?" And he refused to come. So she asked Malachi what to do, and Malachi said, "If you can," they lived out of town, out of New York, and he said, "I have no way to get there, but if you can get me there, I will do it." So one of this lady's grown children drove into New York and picked him up and brought him up to perform extreme unction. And the man, he was in his bed, obviously, and in considerable pain, and his face showed it. It was cramped and gray, and hear Malachi tell it. It was his mouth was downturned, and his eyes were squinting shut. And by the time Malachi actually got into the room and was ready to do all the candles were lighted and so on, and he was ready to do the sacrament, the man had indeed died. He was dead, no longer breathing. And Malachi did the full traditional rite of extreme unction. And just as he was finishing, the man's widow said, Father Malachi, look." And they looked at his face, and this man was smiling. There was a lovely, beatific smile on his face. So you tell me that people don't respond to sacraments, and tell me that they're not supernatural.
When counseling sinners, the sick, the lonely, the mentally ill, husbands and wives experiencing marital problems, the priests and nuns persecuted by heretical superiors, he would give them his address or phone number so he could give them more time later on. He corresponded with thousands this way. In fact, whenever he was a guest on radio or television, he gave out his phone number and address so that people would write him with their troubles. Longtime friend, Father Paul Wickens.
He had a steady stream of penitents, though, a steady stream of people that he advised at every level, single, married, religious, men, women, third order, professed. After Father Malachi died and the calls started coming in, I knew that he had a wide range of contacts, but I had no idea it was that extensive. It was almost as if it was superhuman. I don't know how he ever found time to write. He kept it phone contact, personal contact, by letter, many people, many people, and he advised them and he gave them his time. He never rushed them. He was really a priest first and a writer second. I just want people to know that.
In the last several years, Father Martin gave spiritual counsel to thousands, even by email. Lila Karff, Martin's literary agent, was kind enough to tell us about Father Martin, correspondent.
The letters that came in, I've seen some of them. It's clear how deeply he saw into people's difficulties, and how beautifully our Lord had prepared him to priest to those people. Sometimes he, in order, because he just didn't have enough time to answer the tens and tens of thousands of letters that came, he would sometimes make a call to somebody if he had their phone number, if they gave him a phone number, which people very often did. They would give their address and their phone number, and give them spiritual advice on the telephone. And of course, that always opened up the possibility of more phone calls and took still more time. But he did it by lengthening his day tremendously. He would sometimes say Mass at 4 a.m. or midnight, or in order to be able to get some correspondence in and still try to do his writing, his own writing. And I have to say that because of the tremendous burden of the correspondence, I don't mean that in a bad way, but just a lot of it, he did not get as far as he might have done on the book he wanted to do next. But that was God's will. In a telephone conversation that we had a few months before he died, I don't remember why he said this or what we were talking about. It was germane to the conversation. He said to me, "I want to help people. I want to please people." And I can't tell you how much he loved our Lord.
In his lifetime, Malachi Martin authored 16 books. Most of them made the bestseller list. And it was often assumed that Father Martin was a very wealthy man. However, many were surprised when Father Fiore took out an ad in The Wanderer requesting help with medical bills and funeral arrangements for his old friend Malachi. There's one thing we do know on this subject. We do know that he was very generous with his earnings and used some of his money to put 18 men through the seminary. Martin had no home of his own, but on the suggestion of Cardinal Cook, he rented a room from the Lavanos family in Manhattan. They provided Malachi with a bedroom, a place to write, and a chapel. Every morning he arose at 5:30 and said a Tridentine Mass there.
He worked in the tiniest room you can imagine, and he did everything. He slept there and said Mass there and wrote his books there and wrote his letters there and made his phone calls there.
Close friend and driver Bob Morrow.
He said a very quietly reverential Mass. There was some part of him that was on another plane. On the occasions when I was able to serve Mass for him, it was edifying, and it's something I will never forget, because looking back on it, I wonder why I merited the grace of being there at all.
Mrs. Lavanos did everything she could to help Martin. Mrs. Lavanos was a very proper, matriarchal woman who knew that Malachi would exhaust himself if somebody didn't put their foot down. Surgeon, psychiatrist, close friend Dr. Rama Kumaraswamy explained.
Kaikia Lavanos was like a mother to him, took wonderful care of him, sometimes had to scream at him to stop him from working, but she had a real mother's love for him and did everything she could to make his life comfortable and safe, which was hard to do because he was perfectly willing to work 24 hours a day helping people, and she would put her foot down and say, after 18 hours you have to stop. So I think that she was a blessing for him. she gave herself the job of being his guardian. And sometimes people called her, the Dragon Lady, because she built barriers so people could not get to him sometimes. But she was correct in doing that because she was trying to protect him.
When he was dispensed from his vows of obedience and poverty by Paul VI, he was still a priest, but was no longer a cleric. So instead of a black suit and white collar, he wore a suit and tie, and that's how he dressed during his 30 years in New York City, though he still remained a Catholic priest. He still retained his priestly faculties. Though Martin had an enormous amount of sources and contacts, far too numerous to speak with in this or any other program, there was one person in particular who can speak with knowledge of the obstacles he faced in 1969 while trying to get his first book out to the public, his literary agent, Lila Karp.
The Encounter was the first book that he published after he came to the United States. He had published a little bit before that. But there was his first book in this country was nonfiction. And the campaign, I suppose one would call it, against him started almost at once because the man who was assigned as his editor first lost the manuscript. And then, when he finally found it and read it, said that he would rather publish 100 quatrains of poetry than publish The Encounter. That was his assigned editor. The book was published in spite of him, and what that book did was foretell the crisis into which the three great religions, Christianity, Judaism, and Islam, were falling. It was a book that the Library Journal rated as one of the most important books of the year, and the New York Times even thought it was full of incendiary concepts. But his editor almost saw that it wasn't published.
And that experience with The Encounter by no means was the end of the obstacles they would have in publishing Martin's books.
He said to me, really not that long before he died, he said that we had, and he meant he, but he was being very generous, that we had come up against the most remarkable enemies. And he, even as we were working years ago, when we had particular difficulties about a book, he would say, thinking about the great enemy, the devil, he would say, we must be doing something right. But the point is that his forecasts and the opposition against him always went hand in hand. And it was Christ versus Lucifer all the way, in my opinion. But as I say, he was a fighter first class. So his books really are a 30-year record of foretelling events in the most difficult circumstances and of forecasting what, in many cases, what seemed unbelievable at first, but that have, in fact, happened and have changed the lives of generations of men and women in every part of the world.
Malachi's next release, Three Popes and a Cardinal, was published in 1972. It was an analysis of the times. It was an analysis of three popes who ruled through those times: Popes Pius XII, John XXIII, and Paul VI. Pius XII, Eugenio Pacelli, the perfect Roman, the Prince of Power. Pope John XXIII, Angelo Roncalli, the event, the ecumenical council, a stage for human drama, a theater of the spirit and the living man. Pope Paul VI, Giovanni Montini, the Prince of Agony, strengthened by wisdom, beset by the madness, haunted by the futurists.
Three Popes and the Cardinal was nonfiction, and that was the first time he predicted in the opening sentence of the book, as a matter of fact. He predicted that by the year 2000, as a cliche date, that there would no longer be a religious institution recognizable as the Roman Catholic and Apostolic Church of today. That was in 1972. And his editor, the same editor, wanted to take that not only the prediction, but the whole introduction to that book, wanted to remove it from the book. Fortunately, I was able to save it and got into a a bit of a Donnybrook because of that. But anyway, that prediction has obviously turned out to be completely vindicated by events.
With 1973 came the release of Jesus Now.
Jesus Now finally was the book in which Malachi and that editor parted company. And that book, too, was prophetic in that a lot of people's oxes were gored, I think, in that book, because what he was saying there is that that all of us, and for generations and centuries, have tried to make Jesus into what we want him to be, and have tried to make his church into what we want that to be. But that Jesus now is what he always was and will always be, and that it is Jesus now, in his love for us, who is dismantling what Malachi called our spent society. And with it is dismantling the ecclesiastical, the structural portion of the church, in order to build a new structure to house the ecclesial church that will stand against the very powers of hell. And that, as I say, that book was the book that really did it between him and that editor who was so much against him.
We asked Lila to tell us a little about Malachi's working habits as a writer.
When he was working on a book, he would give me pages, and he would go on writing, and then I would edit behind him. And I had a great advantage as a reader as well as an editor, because we would meet sometimes, and we would just walk. We would walk around the city, and he. Because I learned that it was at times like that he would talk about what was on his mind, and what was on his mind was what he was writing about. And so I got tremendous insights into what he was still working on. I hadn't seen it yet. And it became more, because he knew so much, and his intellect was so great, and his knowledge was so vast. Sometimes he would compress things too much, and it would not be intelligible. I had the advantage of being, because of that element of our working together, I had the advantage of being able to call him up and say, listen, you need to open this out a little more. I want to hear more about da-da-da-da-da, whatever it was he had been telling me about. And it was, those talks were as valuable to me, both professionally and certainly personally, as anything we did together.
For speaking out against corruption, Martin was repaid by many conservatives by being denounced as a teller of tales and another Andrew Greeley. In reality, nothing could be further from the truth. Greeley was one of the leading spokesmen of novelty and heresy, while Martin steadfastly defended the sacred traditions of the church and exposed the very men Greeley admired. Bernard Jensen provides a clear explanation as to the difference between Father Martin and Father Greeley.
Well, he was never airing the dirty laundry of the church in order to air the dirty laundry of the church. That might perhaps set him apart from Andrew Greeley. He usually had a thesis that he was working on, and in order to, let's say, defend the thesis that the church is going through a grave crisis, he would obviously have to provide some supporting evidence for that. It's unavoidable that you're going to have to expose some of the details of the crisis in the church if you're actually going to defend the case that the church is undergoing a crisis.
Greeley despised Malachi Martin. He said so publicly. And it wasn't only the left who used Malachi for target practice. One prominent quote-unquote conservative member of the New York clergy accused him of fathering children. And many at Chancery office used their power and influence to spread utter lies and falsehoods about him. But not all of the comments were negative ones, as his agent Lila Karff relates.
I am speaking from a background of 30 years of working with Malachi, first as his editor, and then over the past not quite 20 years as his editor and literary agent. So I've been with him since he began publishing in this country. And in that time, as he's published his books, one after another, a lot has been made of him as a prophet. And that's true. In his books especially, the predictions he made were very wide-ranging, and they had to do both with church and with state, because there's no separating the two in the end. God is the creator of everything and the master of all, and certainly the master of history. In those predictions he made that were published in his books, he was never wrong. On an individual level, of course, he had just as great a gift for discernment of souls, and many people, some of whom he never even met face-to-face, can tell you about that. But as his editor and agent for such a long time, I am better able to talk about his books, I think. And in a sense, I think his books were the widest and most enduring platform he had for forecasting, and as in the case of the Jesuits, of reporting events that he said would change our lives, and that did change our lives.
Martin Goldman, the editor of Intellectual Digest, had asked Lila if Malachi could write a series of essays on all the ways that men have searched for meaning. So, in 1974, Malachi Martin published a book called The New Castle. One reviewer called The New Castle, quote, an insightful and thrilling onslaught of the modern dislocated consciousness, unquote. It's a work of history, philosophy, prophecy, guiding the reader through the history of different societies that set out to give meaning to the disorder of existence. The New Castle provides an analysis of the civilization of Rome, of Constantinople, the civilizations of Jerusalem, Mecca, Peking, Wittenberg, and also what is known as Americanism. Malachi Martin described his novels as faction, which is to say they were a combination of fact and fiction. 85 to 90% fact with 10 to 15% literary invention, he said. As time went on, he found himself changing the names of the characters in the book in order to, in his words, give the guilty time to go to confession. Traditionalist author and good friend, Dr. Rama Kumaraswamy, elaborates on other reasons why Malachi began writing in the faction style.
He really was trying to find a way to defend what I would call the traditional church, or the traditional values of the church, and he realized the various attacks upon this, and I think he tried to put this into novelistic form so that he could tell things that he knew which he could not tell in any other way, for medical or for legal reasons and so forth. So the novel was for him a way of exposing some of the things that are going on in Rome.
Most of his works concern traditional Catholicism, globalism, geopolitics, and that complex relationship between the Catholic Church and the governments of the world. In the beginning, the American press showered Martin with adulation. Forbes magazine said of him, "No spiritual journey is complete without a Vatican novel by Malachi Martin." The Dallas Morning News wrote, "In biblical times, he would have been called a prophet." But, as with so many in the spotlight, the cheers and accolades were short-lived, and they turned on him in no time at all. The New York Times banned him from their bestseller list, even though he would have made it every time. And when he died, the obituary, which appeared in the Times, only quoted harsh critics and detractors. Father Fiore responded in a letter to the editor in which he wrote, quote, "Your obituary of my collaborator and friend of almost 20 years, Father Malachi Martin, contained one outright falsehood, a slanderous connotation, and repeated the subjective and erroneous biases of several reviews of his books. It is shameful that the Times has used the death of this valiant good priest and brilliant author to heap scorn and scandal upon his memory and accomplishments, unquote. Father Fiore added, I hope the Times does not publish my obituary. On the subject of possession, Malachi Martin was the authority. Close friends remarked on how exhausted, bruised, beaten he was when he would come home from one, and it was not at all uncommon for him to sleep for one day, maybe a day and a half afterwards. Henry V. King.
One morning, it was Thanksgiving morning, he called me to say Happy Thanksgiving and also to say that to ask for prayers. He said, I'm involved in a very difficult exorcism. You won't be hearing from me for a few weeks at least. But he said, pray for me.
In Rome, the United States, and elsewhere, he conducted dozens of exorcisms. His book, Hostage to the Devil, is an excellent documentation on 5 actual cases of demonic possession and exorcism. It was in 1976, with the release of Hostage to the Devil, that Malachi Martin became a world-famous writer.
As an exorcist, when you do exorcisms, minor and major, the demons constantly taunt you with the condition of the church. They say, well, we're in St. Peter's. We can talk to whom we like. We have representatives sitting beside your Pope every day. What are you talking about? We are legit. I'm quoting demons now. This is what is said to you. How dare you? And our prince has been enthroned, installed. And you're still against us? What are you trying to persecute us for? When you're trying to expel demons. And it's a dreadful thing. Oh, you keep repeating the name of Jesus and the prayers and the command to get out. They eventually do, under protest.
And it's the only published record of 5 exorcisms of living Americans. It was based on video and audio tapes because I have been very active in exorcism all my life. It was a bestseller here and abroad, and it still is. What it does is this. It proves that any man or woman over 50 who doesn't realize that out in those streets and in those boardrooms and in the boudoirs and in the corporate headquarters and in the army headquarters and the government chancelleries, who doesn't realize that Satan is alive and active and happy, that man or woman is a jackass. But the devil, the old figure with horns and a dirty tail and yellow eyes and dirty books under his arm, hiding behind the bushes and saying, come over and I'll show you some sin. Oh no, that's myth and superstition. It always was. This is an angelic intelligence, far more potent than any human intelligence could ever be. It's an archangelic intelligence.
Malachi Martin went out of his way to make the distinction between Hollywood's interpretation of possession and the real thing.
Say, if you take, for instance, The Exorcist, the picture of called The Exorcist, with Linda Blair in it, based on Blatty's book, which is based on a real event, by the way, but distorted totally by Blatty and the picture. It really is Dracula Frankenstein horror film to make you shiver, give you goosebumps. And people love getting goosebumps. They love being made nervous, but that doesn't, it's all in the imagination. It's like any horror movie, like any Dracula Frankenstein movie. That's one thing. But I assure you, the reality of exorcism, the reality of demon possession, is totally different. I remember, I'll give you an example. There was a Dr. Hammond, psychologist, who always kept saying the same thing. He said, this is all imagination. He said that these people require very careful therapy. So finally, and he said, let me be present at an exorcism, thing we don't do normally. So finally we admitted him. Hammond never went back to psychiatry. He became a Catholic, and he was Jewish originally. Once he was hit by the reality of the demon, of demonic presence. It's something that you don't forget, and it's nothing like looking at The Exorcist.
He also noted that those involved with the occult are often those you might not suspect.
The Satanists I know, who belong to Luciferian and Satanist covens in New York, are all lawyers, doctors, architects, nurses, brokers, businessmen, entrepreneurs, and they're perfectly respectable citizens. They pay their taxes. and their work as surgeons or as doctors or research scientists is impeccable. No, they're perfectly respectable, but they are worshippers of Lucifer.
In 1988, psychiatrist Dr. M. Scott Peck, author of Roads Less Traveled, noted that Hostage to the Devil was the classic work of the 20th century on the subject of exorcism. Without Martin's remarkably thoughtful cases of spiritual affliction, Peck wrote, it was extremely doubtful that scientists would ever have begun to examine such a dangerous but important subject for another 100 years. Science, particularly the science of psychiatry, and many suffering patients owe this book a deep sense of gratitude. Those words from Dr. M. Scott Peck, a well-known psychiatrist. Many called him a crackpot, a nut who was obsessed with Satanism. His reply was a most convincing one. A lot of people don't believe in the devil, he said. They shake their heads and say it's a myth. I wish to God it was a myth. Father Charles Fiore.
Well, I think Hostage to the Devil, and I've said this many times, is the best work in English on demonic possession in the last half of this century. I just think that it is the best thing available. What it does for those who aren't familiar with it is that it takes 5 actual cases of demonic possession in the United States, which Malachi researched. And you must remember that Malachi himself functioned as an exorcist or as an assistant at exorcisms virtually up to the time of his death. And in these 5 cases, I once asked him, why did you choose these particular 5? And he said, because taken together, they exemplify all of the various aspects of demonic infestation or possession. And it's a masterful work. Now, there are a number of people who object to it because in telling the stories, Malachi used language that was in the transcripts or the official records of the various cases that these people see as bad language, etc. But the point of it is that the devil doesn't, if you'll excuse the expression, the devil doesn't give a damn about bad language. You cannot tell the story of demonic possession or discuss the whys and wherefores of it without taking into consideration the kind of evil that the devil is involved with and how he subverts the hearts of men. And this is what the book is all about.
New York City friend Sal Gadanga.
Malachi has done quite a number of exorcisms, and he's suffered a great deal. He's had heart attacks through them. They suffer a lot. You know, to do an exorcism, a good exorcism, you've got to fast on bread and water for 3 days, and it requires a staunch will, a lot of praying. It's a tough situation. And he suffered a lot with that.
These sessions not only took a great deal out of him physically and emotionally, but also consumed an enormous amount of time out of his schedule, as Bernard Jansen recalled.
We did a 2-part cassette tape series on the subject of exorcism. And on one occasion, he delayed doing a series of interviews because he was involved in an exorcism, and of course he wanted that to be completed before he would do the next series of tapes that we were scheduled for.
Close friend and driver Bob Morrow would on occasion drive Martin to exorcism.
It was not to all that many which were outside of the New York area, because most of them, I was given to understand by Malachi himself, were somewhere within the 5 boroughs of New York, and they often occurred at crazy hours. But the few that I did take him to, he was always very matter-of-fact about what he was going to do, where he was going, and they were physically draining on him, but he never gave any outward appearance of that. I mean, you could occasionally tell, because something like that, of course, takes not only a spiritual but a physical toll. But you know, he was never one to wear anything like that on his sleeve ever. He was, as a Jesuit, as one of the Pope's men who had to go out and become experts in whatever field of life they were in, always with an eye towards, serving the papacy and our Lord. He was an everyday soldier of Christ, and this was just something that he did as part of being a soldier for our Lord.
And when asked whether or not any of the priests in Hostage to the Devil were based on Martin's own experiences, Lila answered,
I don't know. I know that he was involved in exorcisms at the time that he was writing that book. Whether he was actually involved in one of those exorcisms, I'm not certain. I would think that if he had been, it would have been Zio and the Smiler. The one that involved, that took place while Paul VI was visiting New York. That's always been a possibility in my mind, but I never pinned it down with him. I don't believe that he was involved in any of the others, and as a matter of fact, some of them were protracted, as you know, and I don't think he could have been, and many of them were not in this area, and he was in this area, so he didn't do that. But he was involved in many, many exorcisms, and in a sense, he gave his life, in a real, honest-to-goodness contention as a martyr, and a real contention with intelligent evil. Does that answer your question?
The Final Conclave, published in 1978, just before the election of John Paul I. It warned that certain cardinals and other prelates were highly involved with the world of big business. Martin admitted that the character Domenico, the simple holy cardinal, was in real life Cardinal Albino Luciani, who later reigned a short-lived pontificate under the name of John Paul I. Martin was excited about the election of the new pope. He called him a back-to-basics sort of pontiff, a man who had the simplicity, holiness, and strength of will to address the many grave problems that faced the Roman Catholic Church in 78. He predicted that Luciani would restore the Latin Mass, solve the problems of the modern seminaries, and discipline the heretics. Unlike his predecessor, Pope Paul VI, Pope John Paul I planned not to focus solely on Humanae Vitae issues, but rather on all facets of Christ's teaching. Father Martin stressed that it would be an exciting papacy with a pope who would urge Catholics to spend more time feeding the hungry, nursing the sick, visiting shut-ins. He also said that Pope John Paul I was going to attack clericalism and snobbishness among the clergy. Most dangerously, he said, the new pope would stop the Vatican bankers from doing business with evil men and evil families. Malachi had high hopes for Cardinal Luciani, Pope John Paul I, and he made no secret of the fact that that was one of the great disappointments of his life. That morning in 1978, when he awoke to hear the news that the new pope was dead.
We did miss out on a great pope due to the vagaries of death, let's put it like that in a general vague sense, because John Paul I came to the papacy with his entire policy laid out. He was going to, remember it was 78, Kevin, and that's a long time ago, really, in the way things happen today. And in 78, he was going to start a reform of the theologians, and a reform of the nuns, and a reform of the teachers and of the bishops that was feasible in 1978. So much water has passed under the bridge since then that now it's no longer feasible as he planned it. And perhaps that's one of the reasons why he had to die, according to certain people. But about that, I'd rather say very little for the moment because it's a very big question. John Paul II entered, and we all knew that he entered the papacy under the pall of death and the threat of death. And indeed, that threat was almost carried out in 1981, and he's still under that threat of death. Now, and he hasn't the same caliber of character as John Paul I had. John Paul I was a man of no compromises. Yes was yes and no was no. This man is trying desperately to guide his way between forces that have got very strong since then, and threaten indeed to overturn the entire papacy within the church and from without the church.
Lila Karp.
Final Conclave. This was his first book of fiction. But even as fiction, it was hailed by the Washington Post as the only, and not only by the Washington Post, but by a front-page news story printed by the Washington Post with a Vatican dateline. And it was hailed in that news article, as the only book that uncannily predicted the political alliances that led to the election of what they then called Polish bishop. He showed how the white papers are circulated and revised and circulated again. He showed all of the dealings that go into conclave before indeed the Holy Spirit makes his choice. And one of the things he did after we published the Final Conclave, that was the last book of his that I actually published when I was on the, as I like to say, the publishing side of publishing. I'm now on the agenting side of publishing. And he was interviewed a lot. Obviously, we launched that book in a press conference, which is almost unheard of for a work of so-called fiction. And it got a lot of pickup in the press, in the television and the print press. And in one interview at which I was present with a man named John Osinenko, who's gone to God bless him, who was at a major news service in the United States, asked Malachi who he thought would be the next pope. And Malachi named Albino Luciani. And John Osinenko had never heard the name. Most people hadn't. And he just didn't have the nerve to print it. And Malachi made that prediction to a number of people. The only newspaper that I'm aware of in the whole world that picked up on that prediction was Welt am Sonntag in Germany. And I still have the clip of that article. But John Osinenko probably was kicking himself from here to Sunday for not having printed that prediction.
As an archaeologist who had worked on digs in, among other places, Tyre and the Sinai Peninsula, a linguist who specialized in the alphabets and writings of pre-Davidic times, with a doctorate in Semitic languages, who had published a 2-volume work on the Dead Sea Scrolls, who better than Malachi Martin was equipped to write the nearly 500-page novel on the life of perhaps the greatest hero of the Old Law. King of Kings, a 500-page novel exploring the life of David, examined his close ties to the prophet Samuel, the slaying of Goliath, his love-hate relationship with King Saul, and his life as the King of Israel. Published in 1980, it was a success with critics and readers alike. The decline and the fall of the Roman Church was next, a return to the mainstay of Martin's works, and published 1 year following King of Kings. Decline and Fall of the Roman Church traces the history of schisms, heresies, intrigue, and corruption, all the way up to and including the death of John Paul I and the crisis that faced John Paul II.
Father Martin first came to know his friend of nearly 20 years, Father Charles Fiore, in 1983. Fiore, who had left the Dominicans, he later joined the Society of St. Peter in 1992, was the publisher and editor of a quarterly Catholic opinion paper called Idea Inc. After one of Idea Inc.'s first mailings, he received a letter from Malachi Martin. It should be said here that Malachi was one of the most faithful correspondents. He was always quick to return a letter, and it was always personally handwritten, never typed or dictated. Fiore later commented that it wasn't necessary at all for Father Martin to write back, as Malachi could have merely sent in a subscription. In any case, Father Fiore responded, and they soon became fast friends. It was the beginning of their many letters, phone calls, and visits. The two shared common concerns about the teaching and governance of the Church, and the demise of the orders they had once belonged to, the Jesuits and the Dominicans. Father Fiore, retreat master, theologian, and professor at the Institute of Spiritual Theology at River Forest, Illinois, near Chicago, and at the Angelicum in Rome, proofread the manuscripts for works such as The Jesuits, Keys of This Blood, and provided much of the most valuable information in Windswept House.
With 1984, came the release of 2 books, There Is Still Love and Rich Church, Poor Church. There Is Still Love was written on the suggestion of a cab driver who voiced his thoughts to Malachi in a personal conversation about the seeming lack of the presence of God and God's love in the world today. There Is Still Love was a series of 5 parables of modern life, all of which were based on true stories, with the main characters finding themselves in dangerous predicaments. At the most critical point, a gospel character finds his way into the main character's life. This is followed up by an ending or suggested possible endings with Catholic solutions. Rich Church, Poor Church is an expose which documents financial corruption within church hierarchy in Rome. Ever the Vatican insider, Malachi told what needed to be told, showing the corruption for what it was. And he did so with accuracy and without bias. His talents, knowledge, and education went far beyond what you might see in even the most impressive, multi-talented Renaissance man. Martin knew a substantial amount about each and every subject he addressed. As a linguist, he was fluent in nearly a dozen languages, though he knew something about and was capable of understanding many others. His first language, Gaelic, was the ancient language of his native Ireland. His second language was English, but he also spoke German, Greek, ancient and modern, Italian, Latin, Hebrew, Chinese, Flemish, French, and also Russian, which he learned for diplomatic missions. In 1978, in New York, he was interviewed in German over the telephone about the final conclave, and the interviewer was calling from Germany. So it goes without saying that Martin was no dilettante. Once, while walking into the MSNBC studios for an interview, a man in the hallway asked him a complex question concerning a mathematical dimension of the Bible. Martin stopped, listened for a moment, and answered the man's question in length and in detail. Interviewers often referred to Martin as a polymath. During broadcasts, he could answer questions on the widest imaginable range of topics and fields and answer the most difficult questions at length and in depth. And it was common for Martin to invite callers to write or call him at home afterwards. But there was more to him than high intelligence and enormous education, as Lila Karff tells us.
I would compare Malachi to Ignatius or to such a man even as Robert Bellarmine, to the great intellectual Jesuits who also were great priests and saints. And what happens in a case like that is that there is a fusion of grace, of that grace that comes through the sacraments, a fusion of that grace of God with an extraordinary learning and understanding of men and events on an extraordinary scale. There's almost nothing about which he didn't know something, so that he could sit down and have a conversation with some of the finest intellects that, whether Catholic or not, that this world has known in his lifetime. And at the same man could speak with people who had virtually no education, with doormen and truck drivers and cab drivers and garbage collectors and building guards about whatever was on their minds at whatever level they could understand, and he would always introduce into that element of grace, so that it wasn't just a giant intellect, and it wasn't grace without knowledge. It was a fusion of those two things.
In 1987, Martin published another bestseller, The Jesuits. The Jesuits revealed the shocking, behind-the-scenes political intrigue of the new church's revamped and politically correct Society of Jesus. This time he pulled out all the stops. This time, Malachi Martin named names. The Jesuits was a tell-all expose, a story of high treason, deception, infiltration, and compromise, cowardice, utter shame, all within St. Ignatius Loyola's Society of Jesus. Critics called it historically rooted, extensively documented, though there were some things he did not have to research. He'd lived through the experiences. Renowned Jesuit author Father John Hardin called it virtually 100% correct. The Jesuits exposed the new agenda within the order and how the Society of Jesus quietly, gradually evolved into nothing more than a liberal, modernist, heretical version of the Peace Corps. They had abandoned their traditions and their founder's goal to pass on Christ's teaching and administer the sacraments. Henry V. King.
The Jesuits, Dr. Martin contended, was at war against the Catholic Church on two big issues. One, who commands the Roman Catholic Church and lays down the law as to what Catholics must believe, and two, what sort of morals Catholics must practice. Dr. Martin wrote that for many Jesuits, the Church's centralized authority, the command, was unacceptable to them. In a place, or rather in place of a hierarchic hierarchy that we have, they aimed at a church composed of small and autonomous committees of lay people, who they named the people of God, or the people's church. And they all loosely associated only by faith, not by one central authority, such as the papacy claims to be. Society of Jesus, Dr. Martin contended in his book, substituted the now battle for the liberation of one class of men and women in society who are oppressed socially and economically and the victims of political injustice.
The critics implied that Martin was some sort of a Phil Donahue type who relished in telling the dark and depressing side of things, but Lila Karp tells a different story.
I didn't think he would do the book. Actually, I was chatting with an editor about Malachi, and the editor suggested that he'd do a book on the Jesuits, and I said I didn't think he would do it, and I called him, and he said yes, he would. So that shows how much I knew. And that was not a book of prediction, but a book of revelation. He had the courage to see things as they were without skewing them, and then to say what he saw. This book is probably the book that in the doing of which he had to summon all of that courage. I could see how painful it was for him to do this. He was so much a Jesuit to his bones. But at the same time, he could not do it. The suggestion, I think, was from the editor was the hand of God, and I think that he never said this to me, and I'm putting words in his mouth, but I think that he probably saw it as that too. It was time to say what was happening, and he said it, and it's a classic. And I believe that any Catholic, certainly, who doesn't read that book does not have the courage that Malachi Martin had. And anyone beyond, who is not a Catholic, who is not a Jesuit certainly, but who is not a Catholic, who doesn't read that book will, I think, fail to understand the tremendous, deep change that secularism can make in the faithful, and has made even in the best of the faithful.
Well, this was the first book published which, in cameo, outlined what had happened, the major orders of the Church. In brief, between 1965 and 1975, the major orders of the Church, the Jesuits, Dominicans, Franciscans, Carmelites, literally turned their backs on the papacy and proceeded to follow a line about the Church and about the mission of salvation of the Church, which is at variance with the traditional Catholic view of life and death and resurrection. I did merely a cameo study of the Jesuits, and immediately it was applied to all the other orders. They began to realize that something was extremely rotten in the state of Denmark. That if the Jesuits could have gone like that, and they did go like that, then they could explain the vagaries of the Franciscans and the horrible corruption of the Dominican order. And all these orders have been the bastions of the church for centuries. And you know, it's a terrible reflection I have, Bernard, that today, what John Paul II needs at the present moment, like he needs air to breathe, he needs a body of men, highly trained, specialists all, in every possible department and sector of human life. He needs them internationally established at all the choke points of civilization: Africa, Asia, America, North and South, Canada, the Soviet Union, old Europe, Western Europe and Central Europe and Scandinavia. He needs them highly centralized. He needs them utterly obedient to the voice of Peter. He needs them utterly devoted to Our Lady and her Lord. He needs them as priests. And that was the Jesuits. That's exactly what Ignatius had in mind. And today, they are not there any longer.
Father Charles Fiore.
When he wrote the Jesuits, he basically was showing how the Jesuits, the Society of Jesus, one of the most powerful religious congregations in the church, had come to the sorry state in which it was in the years just prior to the Vatican Council, and certainly in the years after the Vatican Council. And he pointed out that how they had fallen from their loyalty to the Holy Father, to the Holy See, and their original mission, which was to be the defenders of the faith in a very special way and great educators, and how they had compromised with the powers that be in the world, particularly in Central and South America with regard to liberation theology, and throughout the church in terms of its taking the most liberal stands on issues, sometimes in apparent opposition to the teaching of the church itself. Now, most of this happened under Father Pedro Arrupe, then the Minister General of the Jesuits in Rome. But after Father Arrupe's ailment or sickness and eventual death, it was picked up by his successors running the Society of Jesus. Now, the point that Malachi makes in the book is basically he speaks in a very personal way. On every page of the book, what leaps out at you is his terrible, deep disappointment in what has become to his beloved Society of Jesus. But he also uses it as a paradigm of what was going on in the church and continues to go on in the church with every religious order of priests and brothers and nuns, without exception, and what is going on in the seminaries of the various dioceses around the world.
The leader in the wolf pack of Catholic theologians who, since 1965, have lacerated and shredded not merely the flank, but the substance of Catholicism. Karl Rahner refused, point blank, at a critical and terribly painful moment in the modern history of the papacy, to defend Catholic teaching on contraception. He would not do that for the Pope himself, who had asked the Jesuits to help him in his desperation. The Jesuits.
In many ways, the Jesuits paralleled George Orwell's 1984. Many Jesuits who read it in manuscript form told him they believed it to be a masterpiece of accuracy, though most did not dare to defend it when the book was denounced upon publication. Following the release of his new novel on the Society of Jesus, Pope John Paul II came to America. He told radio interviewer Kevin Doran of the dilemmas the pontiff faced.
The Catholic Church in America is shot, mainly because of the defection of the nuns, and mainly because of the bad direction given by the local priests and by the bishops. They no longer teach catechism. They no longer teach the basic truths of faith. And no wonder the young people
no longer understand and know their faith and know what a sacrament is and know what confession is and know what sin is, and therefore they're not going to go to Mass or confession, and they're going to indulge in all the sins that our society, our glorious society, tempts them to commit.
The Americanization of the Catholic Church was something that Father Leonard Feeney of Boston had warned about back in the 1940s. Brother Francis Maloof of St. Benedict Center in New Hampshire knew Malachi Martin very well on this particular point.
When he wrote his book about it, there was no mention of Father Feeney in it. And a very prominent friend of ours called him and said, how is it you could write about the Jesuits in the 20th century and you don't mention Father Feeney? Haven't you heard of him? He said, oh, you must be kidding, of course. Who hasn't heard about Father Feeney? But I didn't want to write on that subject on the basis of the information that was given to us as Jesuits. I wanted to get the truth from its source. And the friend who called him told him that he should get in touch with me, which he did immediately. And then he came and visited us, spent some time with us, and I gave him the Loyola and Cabbage to read, and then that was his report. He said, this is the greatest event religiously that happened in this 20th century. He was very, very excited about it. He spoke about it in the strongest terms. And he said, I would like to write a book on this whole thing.
If all religions are true, there is no true religion, because they contradict each other. And if it is okay for anybody to say or do anything, provided he respects your human rights, defined by positive law, not by God, if that's the way it is, then what's the point of any spiritual activity? There's none whatever. And therefore, there's no such thing as the true faith. There's no such thing as the one true church. There's no such thing as there's no salvation outside the church. All that is out the window. I've been at meetings where I've talked about the doctrine of the Church of Catholics, meeting 400 of them. I'm thinking of an audience I had recently in New York. And the moment I said that only Catholics will get to heaven and outside the church there's no salvation, there was almost an audible hiss. They almost one placed at me. It was a breakfast. The chaplain who was standing beside me nearly hit me, because it's dead against the new ethos where everybody's okay. You go traveling by road 22, I'm traveling by 21. We're both arriving at the same good, holy, kind, benign, gentle Godfather. You can discuss papal infallibility. You can discuss the possibility there's no hell, or if there is a hell, there's nobody in it. And you don't get all het up at me. You don't condemn me. They people know it, but papal doctrine is that even political power descends through the papacy. All power on earth comes from Christ, and his only vicar on earth is the Pope. And the idea of democracy, that is the people have power, I'm sorry, that's not Catholic. All power comes from Christ. He said it himself, all power is given to me in heaven and on earth.
Martin wrote in a letter to a friend, the doctrinal facts are, there is no salvation outside the Church of Rome. Just being a sincere Muslim, a sincere Jew, and a sincere Presbyterian, etc., will not save. Invincible ignorance is just a myth. There is no such thing except in theory. The whole idea of Roman Catholicism is based on the elect, i.e., not all will be saved. To another, he wrote, the treatment Father Feeney received from Cushing, Spellman, and Wright was the first overt movement of American modernism. You know, of course, that the Holy See has exonerated Father Leonard completely.
Father Martin planned to write a biography of Father Feeney and began the research, but author Gary Potter was writing his own book on the subject at the time called After the Boston Heresy Case. Father Martin didn't want to interfere with the release of Potter's work and moved on to other projects. He never did complete the work on Father Leonard Feeney. Father Martin's next work was The Keys of This Blood, published in 1990. It was the most scholarly critique of the geopolitical war games between Russia, the West, and the Vatican ever published. At a time when the American media was jubilantly proclaiming the joys of the complete destruction of communism, this work was one of the first to dare to raise questions of doubt. Keys of This Blood was not only a condemnation of Vatican II's policy of appeasing the East, it raised serious questions as to whether or not communism was really dead or merely playing possum. His assertion that Marxism had truly infiltrated the Catholic Church was not only unnerving, but also on the whole quite convincing. Keys also offered some explanation as to why Pope John Paul II was shot in 1981. One critic wrote, Keys of This Blood is not only profound scholarship, but galvanizing drama as well. One must really wonder if communism is as crippled as the media has let on. Moreover, Martin is truly convincing in his assertion that the church has been infiltrated by full-fledged Marxists. Father Charles Fiore.
Keys of This Blood was a very important book because it was, in fact, an analysis of the role of Pope John Paul II in the fight for dominance in the current world. And so what Malachi did in the Keys of This Blood was to analyze in a very specific way what the role of the Roman Catholic Church has been in recent years, in the last quarter century, and the role specifically of the Slavic Pope, as he often refers to him in the book. At the end of the book, Keys of This Blood, Malachi has an epilogue that is very close to being what I would consider prophetic. He saw the events, he knew the main characters, including the Holy Father. He had met and talked with the Holy Father many times, was very highly connected with the Vatican. And so it is phenomenal to somebody who reads the Keys of This Blood, the scope of the book, but also I find especially fascinating that epilogue. And I would suggest to somebody who has read it or has not read it yet at all, that they reread the book or read it for the first time and read that epilogue.
Lila Carr.
When he wrote the book, nobody was yet talking about the New World Order, and we submitted the manuscript, and the editor called it, he read it, and he said that he thought it was Malachi's true tour de force. And he showed it to the publisher, and the publisher took one look at the subtitle, which said, it talked about Pope John Paul II versus East and West for the New World Order, or something along like that, lines like that, but using the phrase the New World Order. And the publisher said, you have to take that phrase off of the title page because it's just off the wall. Everybody will laugh him out of it. It's just not credible. Nobody will believe it. By the time the book was published, everybody, every world leader from Bush to Kohl to Gorbachev to Peking to everybody was talking about the New World Order. So that again proved that he knew more than his publishers knew, and that he was he just read events. He knew what was coming. It was unmistakable to him. He discusses in one particular chapter, he discusses a man named Gramsci, who had a blueprint for winning the world over to Marxism. And it's a blueprint that is holding sway right now. It's a blueprint for secularism and for winning the world to that secularist point of view. That everything is relative. There is no truth. There is only evolving reality, and even God is evolving. It's all of that stuff. But Gramsci had a plan of how to implement it, and that's what's happening now.
Father Paul Wickens.
He's prophetic, and without attempting to be a prophet. He just said, this is what could happen to the church. This is where the church has gone. He has one of his chapters called the Judas Complex, and that is how Judas wanted to remain in the band of Christ, wanted to remain one of the apostles, but he wanted to shake hands with the world. He wanted to adapt the church of Christ to the world, to what the Pharisees and Herod and those people thought of what the Messiah should be like. And he said, Judas started off fine. He was probably a devout young man, and Christ chose him, and he had many graces. But over a period of time, he compromised to such an extent that when he saw that Christ was not going to cooperate, then he betrayed him. Now, he said this is a parallel with most of the Novus Ordo conciliar bishops today. They don't want to leave the church. And these men, who many of them are up there in years, started off sincere and orthodox, but over the years they compromised with the world so many times with the social issues and the material issues and the pressure about reproductive ethics. They compromise so many times. They want this Church of Christ to change. They're doing exactly what Judas did. He calls it the Judas complex.
And of all the books that Malachi Martin wrote, Keys of This Blood was his own personal favorite.